In this world, there are givers and there are takers. The givers don't mind giving because that is a Christian virtue, but even so, there are limits to their generosity. The takers, well, they don't mind taking, and they may have no limit to the amount they're willing to take.
Thanks for joining us on Mission 66, your connection to the Bible teaching of TWR in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao. We're studying Paul's letters to Timothy. Deepen your understanding by downloading our free study guide at mission66.org and following along. Your teacher, John Matthews, and his co-host, Esther Sisulu, begin our study.
Welcome to today's Bible exploration, where we're on a series of studies of the pastoral letters. And we continue through Paul's first letter to Timothy, exploring chapter 5, which talks about caring for those less fortunate. Now, Jesus is known as the Prince of Peace. But if we want peace in our families, in our workplaces, churches, schools, and society at large, it means that we have to put into practice the peace-producing things that he taught. Our teacher, John Matthews, is with us, and he'll present to us the theme, Respect and Purity.
Esther, thank you so much, and so good to be with you all again for this, the latest episode of Mission 66, where we've been looking at the advice which the Apostle Paul wrote to his disciple Timothy, who'd been called into the ministry, pastoring the church in Ephesus. And by way of review, he started out by warning Timothy about false teachers and how to silence lies and promote truth when it comes to doctrine and daily life. And then chapter 2 concentrates on the importance of prayer, not just for ourselves, but for others and for the governments who rule over us. Chapter 3 dealt with qualifications for church leaders, overseers, and deacons. And last time we were in chapter 4, which was an encouragement to remain faithful to Jesus and the Word of God, because many were departing from the faith and replacing the truth with lies that were leading people astray. And so we reach chapter 5 and we find more practical instruction for the church, including God's benevolence plan for widows and how to interact with leadership, showing proper respect and honor to those whom it's due. So let's start, shall we, by reading verse 1. Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. You know, most cultures show a respect, don't they, for the aged, the ones whose grey hairs testify to their many years of life experience. They might not look as pretty right now as once they did, or the faces may be wrinkled, or they walk with a cane because the balance isn't quite what it was. But these were people who helped build cities, people who fought in wars, people who held homes together and risked indeed their futures and raised young people and conferred their blessing and their inheritances on them. And these were women whose hands cooked nourishment, nursed the sick, cleaned the houses, made clothes, instructed the children in good form. And many of their memories contain this untapped resource of wisdom, which they'd gladly impart to us if they were only asked. In many cases, older people are forgotten, but Paul is reminding us that the younger generation are to show proper respect for those who went before us, trailblazers, if you like, be they elderly men or women who've beaten the path for us. And the watchword here in this sentence and in the entire chapter, well, the watchwords are respect and purity, no matter what age we're talking about. And in verse 3, Paul talks about a system which churches had in place to take care of widows and perhaps those who were not capable of earning a living. In verse 3, he says, honor widows who are truly widows. By this he means those women who were left alone and were destitute with no living relatives and no prospects of being remarried. But he goes on to say, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. In other words, Paul here is a good student of human nature, realizes there are those who will try and cheat the system for their own benefit. And when he says they are dead while still alive, he means that selfish people are dead to any spiritual value. He goes on to say, command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than those who don't believe. So families shouldn't expect the church to shoulder all the weight of taking care of older relatives. It's right in the sight of God when I, a Christian adult child, help my aging parents, and in so doing, give them some form of repayment in a real sense for the difficulty and the inconvenience they experienced in raising me. And now we come to verse 9 through 16, which we could call God's welfare system providing food or legitimate benevolence for the relief of widowed members. And it was not government run, it was church run. And it was managed by volunteers, and this shows how it was to work. Verse 9. Let a widow be enrolled if she's not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Now, enrolled here means that there was this system in place that they had to be signed up for, and those enrolled had to be widows who could no longer work or were infirm. It cautions against using church funds for handing out free money to people who were still able to work or else had living family members who could take them in. And again, Paul's understanding of nature, human nature, is pretty sharp, knowing that there would be those who would try and take unfair advantage of the system. But he goes on in verse 13 to say, besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. And now follows instruction for how to relate to our church leadership. And verse 17 says, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honour, especially those who labour in preaching and teaching. What does double honour mean? We'll talk about that with Esther very shortly. For the scripture says, Paul goes on, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the labourer deserves his wages. Do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. As for those elders who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that the rest may stand in fear. In the presence of God and of Jesus Christ and of the elect angels, I charge you to keep these rules without prejudging, doing nothing from partiality. That means equal treatment for the poor as well as for the rich. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, nor take part in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. The sins of some people are conspicuous going before them to judgment, but the sins of others appear later. So also good works are conspicuous, even those that are not cannot remain hidden. Plenty to talk about with you, Esther.
Oh, yes, indeed, John. And you're listening to Mission 66, dear friends. And of course, we're here with our teacher, John Matthews. Now, I'd like to take a moment to share a response from a listener to the Mission 66 broadcast in Brazil. Mission 66 founder Dr. Luis Sayao originally started this broadcast in Brazil, and it is so encouraging to see how the teaching is impacting listeners there. Now, here's a letter that comes from Alexandra, who writes, I discovered Radio Transmundial or Transworld Radio Brazil precisely through the Mission 66 program that I listened to on the music radio at 6:30 p.m. After I discovered RTM on the internet, I started listening to various programs every day. I congratulate you on the excellence of the content and for finding the centrality of Christ Jesus in all the approaches. Today, in particular, I was very happy that you mentioned Corinthians in one of the interactions. I came from a ministry that rejected members being interested in soccer, and they said it was a serious sin. And as was said in the program that just aired, social networks become a sin according to how you use them and the importance you give them. Congratulations on the balanced and doctrinally very well constructed content. Well, we enjoy hearing from listeners around the world, and it's due to your prayer and your financial partnership with Mission 66 that we're able to reach listeners like Alexandra in multiple languages around the world. Now, if you'd like to make a donation to the ministry, please visit mission66.org. That's mission66.org. Now, I have to say, John, that we are so thankful for you because I think that we would be left with quite a few unanswered questions, which, Paul's instructions have raised. Now, I know that one of the heaviest weights that's placed on churches is the management of benevolence or goodwill. And I think we can all agree that we should be a help to people in need, but at the same time, we have to use our money responsibly, right? And there are perhaps many more aspects to church ministry that need the money too, apart from just benevolence.
Yeah, there are many demands, aren't there, on income, Esther, and every church has to figure out how they balance that. Timothy's church evidently had this system for the relief of human need among believers who were members of the church. They probably recognize that you can't help everybody, and in this world there are givers and there are takers. And the givers might not mind giving because that's a Christian virtue, but even so, there are limits to the generosity. But then there are those that will take and may know no limit to the taking as well. Now, at the same time, a good work ethic is a Christian virtue too. And if a member were to take benevolence from their church, then they should certainly be bound by I think sort of paying that forward, if not to the church, then to someone if and when they're able. So what you do with your income is nothing to do with us. But many church members have found that those who support church with the tithe, that is 10% of their income, receive blessing in return. And God promises to do that in the book of Malachi. And Jesus himself said, what you do to the least of these, you do for me. So that is an absolutely fundamental point, I think, of our love for our communities as churches, really important. But look, back to the case here of the Ephesian church helping these widows. They had to see who had the most need, and those also pulled highlights of good reputation and moral conduct before they then paid that aid forward.
All right, well, we see that Paul is teaching here in verse 11 through to verse 14. He's encouraging younger widows to get remarried, and I assume this is in order to ensure that they are provided for, right?
Yeah, that's it. He says younger widows should be encouraged to remarry if the opportunity presents itself, rather than remain on this benevolence roster.
All right, but then in verse 12, it says that they bring judgment on themselves because they've abandoned their former faith. So what faith was that?
Yeah, well, it's not a generalization. He's speaking about more specific examples, and it may well be a reference to some widows that may have taken a vow pledging complete dedication to Christ, perhaps as nuns do, but all of a sudden an eligible bachelor enters the picture and they'd fall in love and forget about the pledge. And it's just, I think, reaffirming that taking a vow before God is a really important thing. In fact, this dates all the way back, doesn't it, to the law? If you go back to Leviticus 27, which is dedicated entirely to vows and how God expects us to keep the promises that we make to him, that it would be better not to vow than to vow and not keep that vow. So when it says these widows bring judgment on themselves for breaking those vows, it's not referring to eternal damnation, but it means that God considers it a default of a promise. Verse 14, though, is different. The younger widows that hadn't made a vow in this regard were free to go ahead, get married, build a family, because that opportunity was there and God said, embrace it.
You know, Paul talks quite a bit about the widows. He spends so much time on this. I wonder how many widows there were in that church. John, do you know?
It's a really good question, Esther. And I think in this letter, when Paul says widows, he may well have meaning a whole category of other people who were in similar circumstances, unable to work, unable to provide for themselves, and that they should be considered the same way the widows are considered here. Because in that time, of course, there was no governmental assistance program, so a widow was truly a needy person and would be destitute unless somebody helped her. And that was pretty common back in those days, so people often looked to the churches for that help.
All right, well, just earlier on when we read in the chapter in verse 17, you actually made a note of this, John. It talks about elders who teach are worthy of a double honor. So what does that mean?
Yeah, I think it means, Esther, that they should receive their reward, whether that be payment or some other reward. In fact, right after that is said, Paul says the labourer is worthy of his wages. So a double honour might well mean a double salary for those whose main job it was to study the scriptures and preach. Churches should, if they're able, make sure that their pastors have enough money to support families and not have to worry about that, because that might cause their ministry to suffer along with the church as well. So, let's be clear about it. Preaching is a noble profession, and ministers who do a good job are certainly worthy of a reasonable salary. And that's got nothing to do with televangelists exploiting television audiences to build their personal empires. That is so wrong and is a subject for another discussion. But what we're talking about here is something quite different to that.
All right, well, I suppose in the same vein, my question to you would be, is it wrong to make an accusation against a leader of the church? And I ask this because of what we read in verse 19. So in other words, what if, say, I'm aware of improper behavior that's going on? Can I make this accusation? Should I?
Well, sure. I think when we know of actual wrongdoing, then, it might not be something we want to do, but it's something that we ought to do. Paul was simply saying here that an elder should not be charged with anything on the basis of one accusation alone. So to answer what you're saying, if you know of something sinful being done by an elder, then you should bring it to the attention of the wider church leadership. If the accusation turned out to be true, the elder or deacon or leader would need then to be rebuked for that before the congregation, Paul says here, but there first needs to be more than one witness to the wrongdoing. Otherwise, elders would be rebuked or removed every time one person made a complaint. Now, on the one hand, pastors and elders are to conduct themselves well enough so that there would be no cause for complaint. But on the other hand, pastors are not perfect. They're not God upon the throne. They're prone to sin just like anybody else. They've been given this special commission, the one anointed by the Lord. And so perhaps like a sports coach who's there to train the saints, help them grow in grace and godliness, they're a bit like that. And so it's right that we should honour those pastors and elders and leaders who do a good job at this and believe the best of them and not gossip about them or talk meanly behind their backs. But of course, Esther, these folks are right in the firing line, and the devil prowls like a lion, looking to upset and create division. And so it does happen that pastors and leaders have been known to fail morally or go off base theologically. And then I think we need to approach with real compassion, understanding, but also courage. and look to resolve the matter in the best way possible. And, I would say this, if you're in a situation where you are accusing your pastor of something, then you need to make sure that it's really something that is actually wrong and not just something that you don't like yourself. And also, I think you better make sure that you're not guilty of the same thing yourself.
Well, in the previous chapter, we spoke about how the elders laid their hands on Timothy to ordain him, right? And now I see in verse 22, Paul tells Timothy to not be hasty in the laying on of hands. So what exactly can we take away from this comparison?
Well, it's a judgment call for churches, because we don't want to discourage talent or ability, and we certainly shouldn't throw aside someone who shows a God-given gift for teaching and leadership. But at the same time, Paul is calling for balance, saying churches shouldn't be too quick to ordain someone to the ministry who's new to the faith or is untried. I guess the warning is, if you ordain someone who's gifted yet involved in ongoing sin, perhaps, then we're complicit, and that's not something we want. So this is why Paul says not to be partakers in this sense.
Some good advice for us there. So let's talk about this recommendation for Timothy to drink a little wine for his frequent ailments. Is this a blanket statement? Is this acceptable for all Christians?
Well, Esther, this is one of those debatable issues which each of us has to answer individually and personally. Wine is known to have medicinal value if taken moderately. It was drunk by Jesus and the disciples. There were circumstances such as the marriage feast at Cana, where Jesus actually turns ordinary water into the finest of wine. And the Bible doesn't then teach abstinence from wine. It doesn't do that, but it does speak of the wisdom of moderation, and it also warns against the dangers of drunkenness.
True. But in Timothy's case, perhaps God could have, simply cured him without the help of wine.
Yeah, maybe that could have been the case. And I think perhaps one of the things that is called for here in terms of the moderation is just the appropriate taking care of ourselves and respecting our own bodies and our own minds,
Yeah, I absolutely get it. John, this has been so great. I think we can finish off this episode with a chapter summary.
Yeah, let's do that, Esther. We see here that Paul is teaching Timothy how to deal with the resources of the church when it comes to helping those who are in need, and appropriate wages for those who are working within the church. And just as we manage our household budgets, the use of the resources in God's kingdom are a sacred trust. And so we are encouraged here to use those resources wisely.
And that, dear friend, is our teacher, John Matthews, leaving us with that wise counsel. Now, before we leave, I want to let you know about the resources that are available to you on twr360.org. You'll find hundreds of Bible programs as well as videos about the life of Jesus and over 30 online radio stations. And you can learn what events affecting Christians are occurring in the world by listening to Mission Network News. There are also audio Bibles for you to experience, and all of this in over 80 languages. You'll find all of this and more on twr360.org. That's twr360.org. And please, friend, don't forget to follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. There you can ask questions and learn more about the ministry. You can also leave a comment about any episode that you found interesting or maybe just had a question about. Just type in Mission 66 in the search line and be a part of the Mission 66 conversation. We look forward to interacting with you on Facebook and on Instagram. Well, thank you, friend, for allowing us to be a part of your day today. And I invite you to join us same time, same place as we conclude our study in 1 Timothy right here on Mission 66.
Has God used today's program in your life? Then you'll want to receive the free study guide that's waiting for you on our website. You can get it right away by downloading it at mission66.org. At mission66.org, you can also leave a comment or make a donation to help this listener-supported ministry. When you give, You're helping listeners experience solid Bible teaching in many languages in some of the most spiritually resistant places in the world. Thank you for helping at Mission66.org. Mission 66 is a ministry of Transworld Radio.